Hey everyone! Tonight we're drifting back to a darker, colder time. A time when castles loomed over damp valleys, the church bells rang like distant warnings, and the word justice had a rather flexible meaning. So, go ahead, dim the lights, pull up your blanket, and let's take a slow, quiet walk through the stone corridors of the Middle Ages, where the smell wasn't great and neither was the food. Because tonight, we're exploring what medieval prisoners actually ate. Spoiler, not much, and often not what you'd call food. Now, when you picture a medieval prison, you might imagine some grimy dungeon, torches flickering, chains rattling, and a poor soul gnawing on a piece of stale bread. That's not entirely wrong. But like most things in medieval Europe, the truth was more complicated, less romantic, and much sadder. You see, in the early Middle Ages, prisons weren't really meant for long-term punishment. They were just waiting rooms for more permanent outcomes, usually execution, exile, or something involving a branding iron. So the idea of giving prisoners regular meals wasn't exactly a priority. Food, if it came at all, came from one of three sources: the prisoner's family, the local clergy, or, if you were very lucky, a sympathetic jailer. If you were unlucky, and statistically you probably were, you'd be left to feed yourself, inside a locked stone room with no access to the outside world. That's right, if no one brought you food, you simply didn't eat. And while that might sound barbaric, well, so was everything else at the time. Let's drift for a moment to England in the 12th century. The word jail, spelled G-A-O-L, because medieval English was a linguistic fever dream, referred to the local prison, often a small stone building attached to a castle or a sheriff's manor. The sheriff was technically in charge of feeding prisoners. In practice, though, he preferred to pocket the funds instead. So if a prisoner wanted to eat, they had to buy their food from the sheriff himself. Yes, the man keeping you locked up also ran the prison cafeteria, which charged inflated prices for old bread and grayish ale. And if you couldn't pay, you'd get what was called prison fare, which usually meant, and I'm not exaggerating, a handful of straw and a bucket of water. Now, if you think that's bad, let's float over to France. In 14th century Paris, the Châtelet prison held everyone from pickpockets to political enemies. It was described by one visiting monk as a pit of filth where men rot alive. He wasn't being poetic. The inmates were crammed together, sometimes 50 or 60 to a room. There were no windows, no toilets, and the floors were layered with straw soaked in, well, you can imagine. Their food came once a day: a single loaf of bread, often moldy, and a cup of water. If they were lucky, the bread came with something called pottage, a thick, gray stew that was basically water, barley, and despair. Sometimes there'd be a bit of onion or cabbage floating in it. Sometimes not. And on feast days, the church's many feast days, prisoners might get a small piece of salted fish, not because anyone cared, but because feeding them meat on holy days was technically a sin. So, yes, religion kept them from starving a little faster. But let's be fair. Not everyone in a medieval prison was miserable. The rich, and there were always rich prisoners, had a very different experience. If you were a noble, even a traitorous one, you can often pay for your own comforts. That included your own food, servants, and sometimes even your own bed. Take, for example, Charles of Orleans, a French nobleman captured by the English at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. He spent 25 years in captivity, but captivity is a generous term. He lived in castles, wrote poetry, and dined better than most free peasants. He had roast meats, wine, fresh bread, and fruit. His imprisonment was essentially a very long, mildly depressing vacation. Compare that to a commoner jailed for stealing that loaf of bread. who might die within weeks from starvation.
Medieval justice, you see, worked on a sliding scale. The higher your birth, the more comfortable your suffering. Now, in the church-run prisons, because of course the church had prisons, the diet was a little different. Monastic jails were meant to punish wayward monks, and their meals reflected that. A monk imprisoned for, say, gluttony or drunkenness would be fed only bread and water. It was poetic justice, starved for his sins of appetite. If he confessed and repented, he might be allowed some beans. Luxury. And yet, in these monastic dungeons, there was at least some structure. Meals came at regular times, and the jailers were, theoretically, concerned with your soul. Secular prisons were not. They were concerned with your money and your silence. By the late Middle Ages, though, the situation improved slightly, mostly thanks to the plague. Yes, the Black Death. It killed so many people that suddenly there was a surplus of empty space and a shortage of jailers. With fewer guards and more abandoned castles, authorities began using any empty building as a makeshift prison. Some were clean, most weren't. Records from 15th century London describe inmates in the Newgate prison being fed twice a week, boiled meat scraps, barley bread, and something called small ale, which was basically watered-down beer. The prisoners called it hell broth because, well, it was. One contemporary observer wrote that the stew was so foul that the stench thereof might cure any appetite. He may not have been exaggerating.
Dungeon we mentioned earlier. We don't know exactly what he ate, but the fact that he finished a book that long suggests he at least had access to bread and water, and possibly a better metabolism than most. Of course, not every prison meal was tragic. There were festive exceptions, executions. Before being hanged, drawn, or quartered, a condemned man might be offered a final meal. The tradition dates back to at least the 12th century. In Germany, one record mentions a prisoner who requested a full roast goose, a jug of wine, and a priest to bless both. He got all three. The priest, reportedly, ate most of the goose. In England, condemned men sometimes asked for ale, cheese, or even oysters. One thief in 1388 requested nothing but a cup of strong beer and a kiss from the barmaid. It's unclear if he got either. And so, the medieval prison meal tells us something quietly profound, or at least mildly depressing, about the time. It wasn't just about punishment. It was about status. Your stomach's comfort was directly tied to your social class. If you were rich, prison was inconvenient. If you were poor, it was a death sentence. And food, or the lack of it, became the language of justice. Let's drift for a moment to the sounds of that world. Imagine the muffled echo of footsteps on stone, the clinking of a bucket chain, a jailer's key turning in the dark. Somewhere, someone coughing, someone praying. And in the corner, a small piece of bread, hard as bone, waiting for a hand that may not reach it in time. That was dinner. And so ends our first slow descent into the dining habits of the damned. In the next part, we'll wander deeper into the cellars of Europe's royal prisons, the Tower, the Bastille, the Stinche, and see how kings and queens treated their own behind bars. Because, of course, they found a way to make even prison political. For now, close your eyes, let the torches dim, and remember, in the Middle Ages, the difference between feast and famine was often just a matter of title. Sleep well.
Tonight, we're drifting back again, but this time not to the damp cells of the average misfortunate. No, we're heading into the gilded miseries of the elite. Because even royals, with all their crowns and pomp,
sometimes ended up behind bars. And you might be surprised, or quietly relieved, to discover that prison life for a king or queen was a very peculiar combination of captivity, comfort, and bureaucratic oddities. So dim the lights, pull up your blanket, and let's gently explore the curious world of royal incarceration. Now, when we imagine a king or queen in prison, it's tempting to picture them chained to a cold stone wall, sighing dramatically, perhaps staring out a tiny window at the gray, indifferent sky. But history rarely gives us such straightforward drama. In practice, a royal prisoner's experience depended largely on political usefulness, family influence, and how fond their captors were of paperwork. And yes, sometimes it involved surprisingly good food, while in other cases, they were left to fume with little more than stale bread. Naturally, the higher the crown, the more elaborate the indignities, or comforts. Take, for example, Charles of Orléans, a French nobleman captured at Agincourt in 1415. His 25-year imprisonment in England is legendary, partly because it wasn't quite what we think of as imprisonment. While his fellow soldiers often faced quick death or slow starvation, Charles was confined to various castles, with walls that were stone, yes, but furnished with some degree of dignity. He had servants, books, and even a library, which he filled with poetry, demonstrating that even behind bars, one could be a slightly melancholy literary celebrity. His meals were a world away from the handful of straw diet of ordinary prisoners. Roast meats, fresh bread, wine, fruit, enough to make a peasant outside the castle walls stare and weep quietly into their thin gruel. It is worth noting, of course, that not all royal prisoners were so pampered. Some ended up in far more precarious situations, largely because of politics. The late medieval period was remarkably efficient at converting family disputes into custodial sentences. Take Margaret of Anjou, Queen Consort of England, who ended up in custody after the Wars of the Roses. Her cells were not quite the luxury suites of her male contemporaries. She was allowed some attendance, but her diet was likely sparse, punctuated with what the warders deemed appropriate for a politically inconvenient queen. Bread, water, perhaps a bit of salted fish. The rest was naturally left to her own resourcefulness, and possibly to negotiation with more sympathetic guards. And yet, even in these less than lavish conditions, there was an interesting hierarchy. Royal status dictated not just the size of one's cell or the softness of one's bedding, but also the quality of the food. Bread might be fresh or just slightly hardened. Wine could be drawn from a decent cask or a sour barrel, and meat could arrive in generous slices or a meager portion of boiled scraps. In some monastic prisons, designed for errant clergy, the diet was simpler, but royals often had their attendants smuggle in items considered luxurious: cheese, fruits, honey, even pastries if the situation allowed. And so, behind iron bars, one could dine well if one's title demanded it, or starve quietly if it did not. Interestingly, some captors treated their royal prisoners with what might be called ceremonial neglect. In the Tower of London, for example, certain high-profile detainees were expected to subsist on what could be considered minimal rations, partly as a display of power. Yet this austerity was often symbolic rather than absolute. Fresh bread might appear in one corner, a small cup of watered wine in another, and a roast fowl might be paraded around before disappearing, reminding the prisoner of the fleeting joys of freedom. There was a certain irony in these gestures. The presence of food that one could not entirely enjoy was a subtle, daily reminder of captivity.
Let's drift over to Spain for a moment, to the late 15th century, and consider the experience of Boabdil, the last Nasrid ruler of Granada. After surrendering the Alhambra, he was briefly confined by the Catholic monarchs. His imprisonment was, by royal standards, relatively benign. He was provided with quarters befitting his status, allowed attendance, and had meals that were, while simple compared to palace feasts, far richer than what an average prisoner would ever see. Still, for someone accustomed to commanding a flourishing kingdom, even a well-prepared plate could feel like a reminder of lost sovereignty. The psychological impact of meals in these cases was as potent as the food itself. In France, during the tumultuous reign of the early Valois kings, it was not uncommon for noble prisoners to be confined in monasteries rather than fortresses. One might expect austere fare in such places: bread, water, occasionally vegetables. But the monks, naturally concerned with hospitality and spiritual propriety, sometimes supplemented diets with simple cheeses or preserved meats. Still, even in these humane settings, royals were constrained by more than food. Their daily lives were regimented, their movements restricted, their interactions carefully supervised. The taste of freedom, like the rare piece of cheese, was a reminder of a world just beyond reach. Now, it is important to acknowledge the extremes. Some royal prisoners, particularly during periods of civil unrest, fared poorly. For example, during the English Civil War, certain captured nobles were deliberately subjected to meager rations to break their spirit. Here, bread might be stale, water scant, and additional nourishment non-existent. The intent was psychological as much as physical, and yet, remarkably, some prisoners maintained their composure, using mealtime as an anchor to the routines of their former, more privileged lives. Even when the food was poor, the ritual of eating, however meager, remained a link to identity and status. And so we can see a fascinating duality. The same diet, or its absence, could be either a comfort or a torment, depending on the prisoner's station. While ordinary inmates fought rats and mold, a prince might nibble a fresh loaf while pondering political correspondence, and a queen could sip wine from a small cup, dreaming quietly of alliances now beyond her reach. Food in these royal cells was never merely sustenance. It was a subtle instrument of power, negotiation, and sometimes poetic injustice. Even minor indulgences could carry symbolic weight. Salted fish on a feast day, a slice of roast meat, a handful of fruit. Each act of provision communicated something unspoken: the captor's mercy, the prisoner's worth, the fine line between political utility and expendability. And for those of us imagining these scenes tonight, there's a quiet poignancy in considering how something as simple as bread could encapsulate the intricate dynamics of power, hierarchy, and human endurance. Of course, while most royals had the advantage of status, even they occasionally faced absurd limitations. Thomas Becket's supporters, during the turbulent days leading to his exile, were expected to provide modest meals for the detained archbishop's allies. Some prisoners, despite their rank, found themselves rationed according to whims, with daily menus dictated by political expediency rather than nutritional need. And yet, it is worth noting that even in these situations, meals could be a source of intellectual and emotional solace, a chance to converse with attendants, to plan strategy, or to simply reflect quietly on the shifting fortunes of life behind walls. And so, we can see a fascinating duality. The same diet, or its absence, could be either a comfort or a torment, depending on the prisoner's station. While ordinary inmates fought rats and mold, a prince might nibble a fresh loaf while pondering political correspondence, and a queen could sip wine from a small cup, dreaming quietly of alliances now beyond her reach. Food in these royal cells was never merely sustenance. It was a subtle instrument of power, negotiation, and sometimes poetic injustice. Even minor indulgences could carry symbolic weight. Salted fish on a feast day, a slice of roast meat, a handful of fruit. each act of provision communicated something unspoken: the captor's mercy, the prisoner's worth, the fine line between political utility and expendability. And for those of us imagining these scenes tonight, there's a quiet poignancy in considering how something as simple as bread could encapsulate the intricate dynamics of power, hierarchy, and human endurance. Even in cases of long-term captivity, food could be both a literal and metaphorical lifeline. Charles of Orleans, despite decades in English hands, wrote poetry that revealed a mind nourished in part by his meals, but equally by reflection and literary engagement. And for many lesser-known royals, a single fresh loaf, a modest cup of wine, or a small piece of cheese could mark the boundary between despair and the quiet resilience needed to endure another day. The subtle textures of these meals, the crust of bread, the warmth of broth, the occasional fruit, formed the backdrop to the larger drama of survival, strategy, and social signaling. And so, dear listener, as you settle into the gentle quiet of your own evening, consider this paradox. Even behind iron bars, with liberty curtailed, status could shape experience, meals could shape morale, and the simplest act of eating could be both a necessity and a statement. In the medieval world, food was never neutral. It was always a reflection of hierarchy, a token of mercy, and sometimes the only real comfort a captive could count on. And now, with that thought softly lingering, we can pause for a moment, letting the image of noble prisoners, bread in hand, fade gently into the quiet of your imagination. Tomorrow, or the next part of our journey, we will drift even deeper, exploring the secret kitchens, hidden cellars, and peculiar culinary arrangements of Europe's most infamous royal prisons, because naturally, even incarceration could be a matter of taste.